Hello everyone, my name is Aina Raj, a CEO coach and founder of UDAN. In my career as a coach, I have come across many entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs. They have shared stories about what makes them different and special. I love stories. Stories about success, stories about failure, learnings, and mistakes. This podcast is all about getting to know CEOs up close and personal, digging a little deeper about their stories, and getting to know how they continue to make a difference and impact in the world. So let's get started. Our first guest is a very special person. I have known him for the past 13 years and watched his journey up close and personal through his 20s, 30s, and 40s. Over the years, he has shared many interesting stories about career, personal life, and leadership, which has made me the person I am today. Introducing VIVEK RAJUKUMAR, my beloved husband and the CEO of 6th Street, GCC's #1 fashion destination. Hello, Vivek.
Thank you for inviting me and having me in this beautiful podcast studio today. Really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yes. Okay. So this is going to get a little awkward, but this is the first time we are sitting across, in a room and talking to each other. So probably let's see how it plays out. Right. Okay. So I am interested to know a little bit about your childhood. So tell us a little bit about how your childhood has shaped you as a person you are today.
I believe that who you're born to is one of the biggest lotteries in life. And I've been very fortunate to be born to two passionate doctors, my mom and my dad, both of whom instilled typical middle class values in me of very strong work ethic, working hard, importance of education, amongst many others. But I think one thing which has been very particular about my parents, which I really take away, is that they were always a combination of fire and ice. My dad, on the one hand, was always highly ambitious, unapologetic about the value he brings to the table, and always aiming to raise the bar and aiming to get to the highest point. On the other hand, my mom has always been extremely grounded, one of the most down-to-earth people you will ever meet, and extremely humble despite her many virtues. I've always tried to take the best out of both, and I've seen that both the approaches work in different contexts, and I've tried to imbibe the best of both values over a period of time, and that's really shaped who I am as a person today.
Very interesting. I like the word that you used, fire and ice. So tell me about your parenting, or rather, our kids. So what, from your parents as fire and ice have you taken and passed it on to your kids, or rather our kids?
I think as a person, I have a natural inclination towards ice, and I'm extremely calm despite what the circumstances. And it's one of the things which has also helped me in my career. But with my kids, I always try to be the calming presence in their lives. And I'm fortunate to have you as someone who can discipline them when they need to, and therefore I could play the easy role of being the cool, calm, and patient dad. So that's the role which I have adopted. But more importantly, I think for me, the philosophy with kids has always been to treat them as human beings who have their own thoughts, aspirations, and needs, and not to treat them with child gloves. And I've really seen how our kids respond to that, and they grow up to assume responsibility when they do that. And I'm really happy to see how our kids are growing up.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Tell us a little bit about your career now that you are a young CEO in your early 40s. So how has the career shaped you? Tell me a little bit about the career journey right from Kerala and how it pans out.
So I started, studying, did my schooling in Trivandrum, and I was in Trivandrum for 21 years through my schooling as well as through my college days, for which I went to engineering college in Kerala called the College of Engineering Trivandrum. So until that point, I was fortunate to live with my parents because I was a day scholar in college as well. After which I've life has taken me in many different directions, many cities, many countries. And so right after my engineering, I decided to do my MBA, and I went to Bangalore. I did my MBA from IIM Bangalore. Was very fortunate to be amongst the best from all over India, and really gain a lot of wide different perspective there. And since I didn't really know what I wanted to do in life, I was advised to take consulting as a career, because that's a career where you can experiment with different companies, different assignments until you decide what you want to do. So that's what I did. I took up a consulting career, worked with a company called KPMG, which is a audit, consulting and tax advisory firm. Worked there, started my career in Bombay, today's Mumbai. Worked there for about 4 years, then moved to Bangalore, worked again with KPMG for about a couple of years before moving to Flipkart. The reason I moved from MNC consulting firm to Flipkart, which was then a startup in 2013, was because I genuinely developed a passion for retail as a sector when I got an opportunity to work with it, and then realized that this is where I want to be. Except that most retailers didn't want to take a consultant in, and at that point, Flipkart was gracious enough to accept me into the fold, and I took up that opportunity and never looked back since. Worked with Flipkart for about 5 years. Was very fortunate to have a ringside view to the growth of e-commerce in India. After 5 excellent years, I had an opportunity to take up a role in Dubai, and since it was an international role, I took up the opportunity to get that exposure. Came to Dubai with a company called Landmark Group, worked there for about 3 years, after which I got an opportunity to work with Amazon in Europe. So moved to Luxembourg to take up role in Amazon. I worked there for 4 years. It almost felt like going back to school for leadership, except that I was getting paid to do it. It was amazing 4 years, post which I came back to Dubai now with Apparel Group, where I run the e-commerce or digital arm of Apparel Group called Sixth Street. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
Okay, so I see that you have moved places quite a bit of time. So how has that shaped you, or is there something that you have learned or struggled with in your career and your personal life because of was it a conscious decision to move places, or it just came by choice?
So I think I never designed my life in such a way that I would get to see different places, but I've always been a very curious person. In everything I do, I try to ask many whys. Why do things work the way they are? Why do things happen the way they are? Why do people behave the way they do? Why do companies behave the way they do? And so on. So following my natural curiosity, it so happened that one of the ways to explore that curiosity is by traveling and visiting different parts of the world. So as a family, we've always been fond of travel, but when I got the opportunity to explore international countries by living and working there, it was a very unique opportunity which I couldn't say no to. And in hindsight, I would say that a lot of who I am today in terms of what has shaped my perspective has definitely been thanks to the different and diverse exposures that I've had with different cultures I've had the pleasure of working with in different countries. A lot of that I owe to different people exposing me to ways of working and to points of views which I wouldn't otherwise have been exposed to. And if I have to summarize one thing which you take away from getting exposed to so many different countries and cultures is it opens up your mind and it makes you more adaptable to accepting diverse points of view.
Right. Okay, great. All right. So in my profession and what we do at UDAN is a lot about corporate trainings and employee development, personality development trainings, etc. And one very prominent challenge I face in young professionals is the ability to or inability to speak confidently and articulate and structure their thoughts, especially when English is not a native language. So for someone who's young and who's born and brought up in Kerala, what do you think? How has it been for you? Was it difficult for you to speak when you travel to so many countries and being able to, speak to multiple people? Are there any tips for young people?
So I think I'll start with the story of who I used to be. I think I've always been, as I said, I spent my first 21 years in Kerala. And at that point, even though I went to an English medium school, we always used to communicate in Malayalam, except for the fact that the books, textbooks were in English. And therefore, English as a language was not something that we used in our day-to-day life. As a result, our confidence in using that language in any context, let alone professional context, was always low. Interestingly, and this continued until my engineering, and I never felt the need to change that or improve that. However, while in my engineering days, there was a senior of mine who came to our college, who had gone to IIM Calcutta after engineering, and when he came to our campus to give a talk, I was blown away by how he spoke. I don't even remember what he talked about. All I remember is the way he talked and the lasting impression it left on me. I just felt that, oh my God, if I could talk like him one day, that would be so amazing. And that was the single trigger which prompted me and inspired me to apply for the common admission test and eventually to get into IIM Bangalore. So when I set target, and until that day I never felt that it was an important thing. But the day I saw what confident English speaking can do to you, it changed my life. And that's when I decided that this is something I want to do as well. And it's taken many years and many years of consistent effort to get to where I am today. And if I have to give one advice to anyone who wants to build any skill, let alone speaking confidently in English, it would be that the best way to get better at or confident at something is by doing it and putting yourself in tough situations where you need to do it. So the way I did it in my college days when I decided I want to do this is by throwing myself into very uncomfortable situations like competitions where I was supposed to go on a stage and speak to people when I knew I had when I used to get anxiety attacks while climbing on stage. Right? Even though I knew it, I pushed myself to do it. And the first few times I nearly had an anxiety attack, but over time I learned to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's the only way you can really acquire a skill that you don't have, or if you want to stretch and grow yourself to become good at something that you don't have. So you just have to put yourself out there and believe in the input that over time you'll get better at it.
Right. Absolutely. So coming to giving input and then doing it consistently. Now I have watched you, grow as a person. So tell us a little bit about, your rituals or habits, because I've seen that you do a lot of probably boring things consistently over a period of time, which I think creates a magnitude of difference in the way you look and the way you speak. So what are some of the small habits that you do on a daily basis?
So I think there is a big authority on this subject called James Clear, who has written a wonderful book, Atomic Habits, which I would recommend anyone who wants to develop habits to read. But one of the things that he says interestingly in his book is most people, when they pick up habits, they think of what they can do on their best day. On the other hand, you need to pick up habits that you can do or you will do even on your worst day. And that's what makes habits stick. Now, on my part, while there are many boring, consistent habits that I have, I think the one which has been life-changing for me is probably my fitness habits. I think at the age of 35, I realized that I was in the worst shape of my physical fitness. Even though I was doing very well from a career perspective, I had really ignored my health for many years, and I was reaching a point where I had a health breakdown. And that's when I decided that whatever I'm going to do from that day onwards, I'm never going to deprioritize my health. And since that day, I've always been extremely focused on and doing few things right. And it's been a journey, but I think when it comes to fitness, for instance, I make sure that I do at least 5 days of workouts. In my case, mostly gymming. When I was younger, I also used to do martial arts. These days, I prefer just hitting the gym. There are days when I don't feel like it, and then I decide to go for a run. But I ensure that I get some kind of physical activity at least 5 days a week. So that's number one. And number two, I always prefer consistency over intensity, which means there are many days when I don't feel completely up to it, but I still force myself to show up. And instead of a regular 45-minute or 1 hour workout, I do a 30-minute workout, and that's fine. As long as I do that, I still get my endorphins and I feel comfortable and happy that I've done my bit for the day. But more importantly, I think the second part of my physical fitness has been around inputs and diet. So I think we know inherently that what you eat is very important, but it's something that we find very difficult to control or manage as well. My philosophy here has been never to tell myself not to do something, because as humans we are biased for action. We can tell ourselves to do something, but to not do something is tough.
Interesting, yes.
So what I do tell myself is, on a regular day in a business as usual scenario, this is what you should eat. And that's what I stick to, right?
Okay.
So I have a regular schedule, which is very predictable, very boring set of things which I do, but I never tell myself don't do this, right? So as long as my everyday regular diet is healthy, full of protein, I'm taken care of, and then I can indulge myself whenever I need to. So that's been my philosophy. But the core of what I would say helps you build great habits is your willingness to show up even in the worst days, even in the toughest of days, and two, your willingness to adapt what you consider as your habit. Meaning, it doesn't have to be every day 45 days and 100 pounds. It can be 30 minutes and 60 pounds on a day when you are not completely up to it. But do it. Don't skip it.
Yeah. No, but a lot of people, including me, find this excuse of not finding the time to be able to do it, right? So you talked, okay, maybe instead of 1 hour, just do 30 minutes. But then still, when you have other competing priorities, and you don't find, you struggle with a lot of things that is going on, especially with a stressful work day, how do you manage to also find the time to, and also push yourself to do this?
It's interesting that we tell ourselves that we don't find time. The reality is that we decide what to spend our time on. And some things are kind of pre-decided or pre-coded for us, right? There are things that you do every day which you don't even think or which you don't question yourself around, but you do it because you know it's something that you need to do. So for me, fitness has become one such thing. It took a long time to kind of get there, but you got to make it. And one of the ways in which you can do it is by designing your life around the things which you want to be part of your daily routine. For example, because I know that fitness is part of my daily routine and I know that I cannot spend too much time traveling to and fro, I always try to live in a place which already has a well-equipped gym. That's a basic starting point for me to find a place to live in. But more importantly, in my day, the part for fitness is already baked in. So in my calendar, my fitness slots are already blocked.
Okay.
So that way, that time is already blocked out and it's not available for anything else, right? So it's already hard-coded in the calendar.
Okay.
The only scenario where I find it tough is when I am traveling. But even when I'm traveling, I ensure that I keep my time for the dedicated to fitness, which is meant only for that.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about leadership and managing people, right? So I want to touch specifically on your decision on working with people and basically hiring people. So what are some of the open-ended questions that you may have, when you try to hire someone or have a conversation with someone? How do you know that, by intuition or by the conversation, how do you know that, okay, this is the way they think and probably this is a good candidate to be able to work with?
I think hiring is one of the most important things that any leader would do. And it's probably one of the toughest things too, because you're trying to make a decision about whether a person is a great fit in the context of a 1 hour discussion, which is very tough and it's always error prone. Having said that, there is one open-ended question that's been my favorite to ask people and to hear them out, which is what is the one thing or one project that you've done in your life which you're most proud about? The reason I ask this question is because one, it helps me understand what is important to that person. What do they consider as an achievement? What brings them pride? Number two, it tells me how high is their bar. When they talk about the achievement, then or the project, it tells me how high the bar is. And number three, it also tells me a lot about the person that she or he is. Because, as an example, there are people who have told me that the most proud thing they did was something which in which they failed, but they were proud about it because they were proud of how they came out of it and what they learned out of that experience. And that was one of the most wonderful answers I ever received from someone. So this question is very open-ended and it can be answered in very different ways. And there are people who answer it based on the latest thing that they've done, and people who answer it based on something they did from their childhood as well. So it's a very diverse question that opens up a lot of possibility, gets them to talk and gets them to think and reflect on what they value in life. So it tells me a lot about their value system by asking such an open-ended question.
Right. Okay, interestingly, tell us a little bit about one of the best hiring decision that you have had. Maybe, you thought that this would not be a good hiring decision, but you still went with it, but then that candidate turned out to be a high performer. Also, one of the worst hiring decisions, which is you thought that probably this is a very good candidate, but then after the hiring took place, the candidate did not perform as much.
I think the worst one comes to mind really quickly in my mind. So I think once I got the opportunity to go to the Indian School of Business for hiring, and I was amongst the panel for my company hiring fresh graduates, and we met many candidates, of whom one stood out very clearly with his energy. I was outright impressed by the level of energy, the level of enthusiasm he brought to the table, and the passion with which he talked about all the things he had done in life, and had a very clear perspective on why he wanted to join the firm as well. I was so bowled over by this that I was extremely enthusiastic about this candidate, and not only did we make the offer, I made sure that he joined my team when he joined the company a couple of months later. Interestingly, I had so high hopes on him that I gave him one of the very critical roles that we had in my team, and I treated him the way I could see. I thought I saw a younger version of myself, and I treated him the way I wanted to be treated at that point of time, which is being given full autonomy and being empowered to solve the problems. So I just threw problems at him and expected that he'll come through. Over time, I realized that he was really struggling. And the worst part was, he wasn't speaking up about it either. And one day I eventually confronted him and asked him, are you on top of this? Are you struggling? Initially he was defensive, but eventually he broke down and said that, of course I'm struggling. And the worst part is I couldn't even talk to you because you always had such high expectations that I didn't want to let you down.
Oh, okay.
And eventually I realized that while he was extremely good, his passions lay elsewhere. And he was an extremely analytical person, extremely creative person whom I had thrust into a highly analytical role where his natural talents were not being utilized, and I had completely misjudged where he should have been in the first place. So I learned from that mistake, and eventually, I moved him to another role where he flourished and he did very well for himself. But I realized one lesson that, sometimes you can get blinded by what you see as the external markers of competence, and different kinds of competence requires different kind of external markers, and it may not always look the same all the time. So that was a valuable lesson I took away from this particular experience.
Okay, interesting. Talking about the Gen Z workforce, because that's that's a trending topic. So I come across a lot of Gen Z professionals during the training programs and whatever we do do for organizations. So one common scenario that I've seen across, irrespective of what the organization is, what the company culture is, that there is a tendency to this person would be performing really well. He or she would be a high performer, but then due to some silly reason, they would just quit or throw away their careers. Is that something that you have come across in your career, or do you think is this a problem of Gen Z, or is this something else?
Interesting. I think there are multiple layers to this question. So, first of all, what is silly to one may not be silly to another. What we might consider silly might be extremely important to them because the value system that each of us come with is very different. Having said that, I've indeed observed a trend where people get offended by feedback, and not just Gen Z, but across the board, there are many people. Increasingly, a trend where people get extremely defensive when they get development feedback because they tend to take it personally and see it as if they are not valued and that they are being shown a negative light. And I think this is a very, very important thing for people to learn because I was told when I was very young by one of my mentors that feedback is a gift. You need to accept it graciously. What you do with it is your choice. But accepting, when someone takes out time and effort to give you feedback, you should accept it with grace and thank them. After that, you could reflect on it for yourself and decide how much of it is true, how much of it you accept, and what you want to act on.
Okay.
But being defensive is one of the worst things you can do when someone gives you feedback. And there is also, I think, while partly the blame lies with people who are being defensive when they're getting the feedback, I think partly it's also about how you give feedback. And I think increasingly managers and leaders need to also be empathetic about how they deliver feedback. Because very often managers are very happy to have performance conversations where they talk about what worked well, what didn't work well, and point out gaps. But very rarely do I see managers taking time out to have development conversations which are focused on skills and competencies, what they demonstrated and what they did not demonstrate. And even when they do, they often do not reflect or associate that feedback with a specific instance. Ideally, you could give feedback in a format of a situation behavior impact where you could point out that this was a situation, this was the behavior you demonstrated, and this was the impact it had on someone. Now, when it comes to managers or leaders, what they need to do is they need to first establish trust with the person and tell them that they are invested in that person, they value the person, and here are few reasons why they believe in the person. If you start with that and then tell the person that, having said this, there are few areas where I believe you have an opportunity to develop, and then go into that development feedback mode, then people would be much more receptive to accept that feedback and act on that feedback. So there is a responsibility on both the manager side and employee side to make sure that feedback is given well and feedback is received well. And that's the most important thing if you want to grow.
Yes. So, one thing, Vivek, now that you talked about feedback, both about receiving and also giving feedbacks. Now, when you believe that you are a high performer, you're so confident at your work, you're technically very strong, and then someone comes and gives you a critical feedback. It could be a negative feedback also. Now that will completely, put you on the defensive. So there is something called ego at play when you do this, right? So how can I manage ego as a leader? Now as a fresher, okay, probably you're a little bit more adaptable, you're learning. But then if I have worked for over, 15, 20 years and I'm the best at what I do, still then how do I accept feedback?
I think this talks directly to me because it is something which I've experienced in my career as well. So I think I'll talk about a story from my stint in Flipkart where I was a rising star. I used to do extremely well as an individual contributor. I had done well for myself, and therefore I had earned a name for being someone who can be thrown the toughest problem statements and someone who can be relied on to solve them. So once I was given a problem statement of fixing a particular category where we had to grow our business, and I thought I came up with a solution which works really well. And then I went to the teams who had to deliver that solution, and I asked them to do what I thought was the right thing to do. Interestingly, the two teams who had to execute this solution, they were at loggerheads with each other, and they were never getting along with each other until I came into the picture. When they both felt that they had now found a common enemy in me, and they actually came close to each other, but they went and escalated to the management saying, now we are happy to work with each other. We'll do whatever you want. Just get this jerk off us. So I was characterized as a brilliant jerk at that point of time. And interestingly, my manager pulled me aside that performance cycle and told me that, look, you've delivered great work, but the way you've done things is just not acceptable, and this is not becoming of a leader. This is not what we expect our leaders to role model in the company. And we need you to be more than smart and brilliant. We need you to be someone that people want to work with, people look up to and respect and want to work with. It was very harsh and damning feedback, and it was a moment when I realized that what got me here won't get me there, and I really had to reflect on how to mend my ways. And I had to shed my ego to start with, because the first thing I did was to go and speak to these functions and tell them that look, here's the feedback I've got, and I accept that I may not have been empathetic in the way I dealt with you. Why don't you tell me how we can solve this together? This is the problem. How do you think we can do this together? They did come up with something which I thought was not the first best solution, but that's also the time I realized that sometimes the second best or third best solution is fine as long as people are bought into it, because that ownership brings a lot of accountability, and it actually can deliver better solutions than the first best theoretical solution. So it was not easy for someone who thought, who was a high flyer, who was doing really well, to be told that you need to take people along. Initially, I blamed it on others. I externalized it, saying, okay, it's all politics. They're all ganging up against me and so on. But when I sat down and reflected on it and really thought about it, I could see that I was not being empathetic, and I was forcing things on people which were not in line with how they wanted to do things. And at the end of the day, it's easy to go fast if you're going alone, but if you want to go far, you need to take people along.
Right.
So I think ego is something which is within you. So the good part is that you can control it if you want.
Yes.
But the tough part is you need to really sit with yourself and be honest with yourself about what you can do to change things, because it's easy to externalize the blame. It's always tougher to internalize it. But that's exactly what you need to do when you get a feedback like this the next time.
Okay, Vivek, I have observed, in your career, there have been very high points, as well as you have gone through lowest of lowest points. Now, I'm very curious to know, how do you, that it's the lowest point, and you decide that, I want to give up and this is done. I don't want to continue. But then how do you rise from there? How do you become so resilient and rise up and then still power through and get things done?
I think resilience is the most underestimated skill which is important for success. Now, why I say this is because anyone who's been successful would have taken big, bold bets, difficult risks. And when you take those risks, you are bound to fail many times. And therefore, what gets you through that is your ability to stay resilient. So my favorite quote here is from Roger Federer. And I really like to refer to this analogy because Federer says this, that in his career as a all-time reigning world champion in tennis, he's only ever won about 50% of his points that he's played in matches. So what he says is that when I play a point, I play it as if it's the only thing that matters in the world, and it is. But the moment that point is over, I completely forget it and I move on to the next point. It's the exact same analogy which I try to bring into my life and my career. When I am doing a particular project or in a role, I give it my 100%, as if that's the only thing that matters in the world.
Mm.
And I do my best. Despite that, I fail many times. I would say, again, drawing this analogy, I would have failed 50% of the things that I would have taken on in my career. But when I do fail, I acknowledge it, I internalize the failure, and then I tell myself that tomorrow is another day. And then, I decide to, embrace something else, which is the next challenge. And once I do, I completely leave this behind me. When I say that, I leave it behind me from a perspective of having no regrets. But what I do take away from the experience is the learnings. So I reflect a lot. And I think I say this often. A lot of people think that experience helps you develop great judgment. The reality is, experience on its own doesn't give you judgment unless you reflect a lot. So experience plus reflection is what gives you judgment. So I tend to reflect a lot on what could have been different, why it failed, what was the assumption I made which turned out to be wrong, and what did I do which I thought will deliver result which didn't deliver result. So I take that learning, but then I focus on the next project as if that is the only thing that matters in the world, and I completely forget about the old one. Easy to say, tough to do, but it takes a lot of conscious practice. And as I said in the beginning, the best way to get better at anything is by practicing it. So the next time you have an opportunity to take a very difficult bet where you're likely to fail, go for it. But learn if you do fail, learn from it and move on as if it doesn't matter the moment it's over.
Yeah. So you being a CEO, you have a lot of people to manage. So it's easier to manage people who are reporting to you, but there are some difficult people that who sits on top of you, right? Now, how do you manage powerful people and still get things done?
So I've seen two extremes here in the way people approach this, right? So either people think that their work should speak for itself and they don't care enough to manage their stakeholders. Or people go all the way out to get visibility and drive narratives, often at the expense of their work, thinking visibility is what is the ultimate end objective. And I think the truth is more nuanced. When you have stakeholders, whether they're senior, junior, peer, it's extremely important to build trust, earn their trust, and build respect with those stakeholders. And of course, doing great work is the starting point, but that alone is not enough. And oftentimes when you find yourself at loggerheads with a particular stakeholder, it is because of either of two things being the case. Either they have a different perspective from you, or they have a different goal or objective they want to achieve from what yours is. So the starting point is for you to understand their perspective and their goal. So what I do is I spend intentionally time investing in that relationship ahead of when I need that relationship. But also, if I find myself in a position where I need to convince someone who is not on the same page, then I try to understand their perspective, where they're coming from, why they're coming from, the place they're coming from, and what is the goal or objective they're trying to achieve.
Can you give an example of because to understand a little better, can you give me an example of perspective and goal? How different are these?
Okay. So goal is an outcome, right? So goal is usually an outcome that someone is trying to achieve. For example, typical example of a difference in goal would be if one person is trying to achieve top line and another person is trying to drive bottom line, there are always conflicts between the two, and that could be a challenge. Perspective is about the lens that you are using to look at a problem. For example, you could apply if you're trying to solve a business problem. You could either come from the lens of saying that my competition is doing this, the best in the market is doing this, and therefore this is what I could be doing, I should be doing. An alternative perspective, an alternative lens is, okay, my competition is already doing this and my strength is different from my competition, so I should not do it. Let me do something which is different from my competition. Now, both are valid views, except that both are coming from a very different perspective, right?
Yeah, okay.
In one sense, you are saying that you can copy your competition, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. That's one valid perspective. The other perspective says that if my competition is doing X, let me do Y. And that's a better way to compete with them and differentiate myself. So this is perspective. So perspective is more the lens and the input. Goal is the outcome or the output.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more about how do you manage perspective and the goal?
Okay. So when I find myself in conflict with a stakeholder who has a different goal or different perspective, I try to understand how they arrived at their perspective and what their lens is. And then I also try to understand what can influence them. Some people, for example, are influenced by numbers. They are very data driven, and therefore data speaks to them. On the other hand, there are some other people who are more influenced by benchmarks or inspiration. They get inspired by what's happening in the market, what the best in the market are doing. So then in that case, examples of what others have done and what have worked will work for them. There are also people who get inspired or who are influenced by specific people that they trust. So in that case, I try to understand who is it that they trust, who do they listen to. Can I then speak to that person and get that person on board first? Right? So I try to understand what is the difference in perspective and who or how or who or what can influence that perspective. And the combination of the two then tells me how I should plan to influence that person. Now, having said all this, right, it's very important to also keep an open mind. There have been times when I discovered when I went on this path that maybe my perspective was wrong to start with. So it is very important that in the light of new evidence or new information, you change your mind if that's the right thing to do. And that's extremely critical. If you're not willing to do that, then it'll come across as you are just pushing your perspective down.
Okay, a little off the track. What's your take on workplace romance? Is it good or bad?
So I think our perspectives are shaped by our experiences, and my experience in my career tells me that workplace romances do not work, and it's not worth the risk that it brings. So I have seen many colleagues who have indulged in workplace romance, and all of whom unfortunately had very negative outcomes, ranging from someone's car windshield being broken by their ex-romantic partner to more severe scenarios where someone even tried to attempt a suicide because of a failed workplace romance relationship. All of these leave lasting traumas, whether it is within the workplace or outside the workplace. But when it is within the workplace, there's an additional complication that it also spoils your workplace ambience and potentially disrupts your career as well. So I would strongly advise you to think twice about having workplace romance, because there are so many great people out there, and you could find the space to keep the two separate.
Yes. Okay. So I think we are coming to the end of the session. So Vivek, tell us if someone wants to be successful like you are in their careers, what are the 3 essential skills that they should develop? Think of someone who is in their 20s, who's just started their career.
So I think the most important 3 skills, I would call it values, and then I will also translate into skills. The 3 key values that is most important to succeed is curiosity, ownership, and resilience. Now, let me translate these into skills. So curiosity seems simple, seems like something everyone is born with. And yes, most kids are very curious, but it takes a lot to nurture that curiosity and carry on that curiosity. As kids, all of us are curious, but somewhere we lose our curiosity. So the willingness to keep asking why, the willingness to keep probing yourself on why things work the way they do is extremely important. In a world, even more so in a world where information and intelligence is commoditized, it's your curiosity which will lead you down a path of leadership. The second one is ownership. While it's a value, the way it translates to a skill is about getting things done. And Barack Obama says this, that the people who are most valued in the world are people who are doers, who get things done. And why is ownership so important? Because it's very easy to say that I've done my part. And I see a lot of people who take pride in saying that. Unfortunately, the problems we face in this world are so complex and so ambiguous that doing your part is not enough. Being someone who will get things done no matter what it takes, whether it takes convincing X other people, finding resources from X other places. That is what makes you really valuable today as a professional. And lastly, resilience, because as I said, your ability to move to great places in career will depend on your ability to take risks. And you can only take risks if you're willing to live with the outcomes. Taking risk means that there's a high chance of failure. And when you fail, you need to have a way to come out of that failure without feeling as if everything's lost. Everyone fails. The speed with which you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and comes back into the game is what determines successful person from someone who stays in that failure zone.
Yeah.
So to recap, the three things that will really step change your career and will always remain relevant whether or not AI aids us or not aids us is curiosity, ownership, and resilience.
Okay, thank you so much, Vivek. All our conversations have been very insightful, interesting, and also inspiring. As usual, this one also ticks the bucket. So, thank you so much, and speak to you soon.
This was very special because I was speaking to my dear wife, Aina, who's also one of the most passionate coaches I've found out there. She has had a very fulfilling career in technology space, and yet she decided to do this because this is something that really is close to her heart, and she has a huge passion for transforming people's lives through a combination of coaching, training, and mentoring. And I wish you the very best for this.
Thank you, Vivek.